Okay, Jude. That's our study tonight. Ken made the comment, you know Jude's only one chapter, right? And he looked at the... I'm like, yeah. But I had to add a few extra chapters to it. Yeah, it is. And I was thinking that when I was putting everything together, I was like, oh, okay, we're going to get through this really fast. But then the more I started putting together, I said, there's some things I want to cover here. So, Jude. Authorship. Well, we begin with the authorship. This is going to be the longest section we're going to deal with, and I'll explain why once we get through the first part of this introduction. So the author refers to himself as Jude, the servant of Jesus Christ and brother of James, verse 1. So he mentions his name in the epistle. Since this Jude calls himself the brother of James, we know he is one of the Lord's brothers in flesh. James was a brother of Christ. Jude then is also a brother of the Lord in the flesh. So this would, in all likelihood, be this Jude, his brother. There's other Judes. In fact, the Hebrew for Jude is Judas. So there's other Judes in there, but because he specifically mentions that he is the servant of Jesus Christ and brother of James, he doesn't say brother of Jesus, maybe out of respect, reverence, whatever. But he says James, and we know that James is a brother of Jesus, so is he. Jude and his other brothers did not believe in Jesus until after the resurrection. We find that in the Gospel of John. Remember, they didn't believe that he was who he claimed to be. There comes a time when they do believe. Although he was not as... Hey, Tom. What happened to it? No, I'm connected here. Are you on number 2? No, I am connected to it. Yeah, there you go. It looks just like what we're looking for. Hang on. No, it shows I'm connected. Yeah, number 2. Why was it on earlier? It's not on there. Hang on, let me try this reconnection here. It's like not even connecting here anymore. Well, it's not that, it's just not even mirroring to it now. I can't even get it to mirror. You know what happened? All right, well, you've got your handout. We're going to go through that. All right, so you got your handout. You can take a look at your handout if you want to follow along in that way because I can't get it to, oh, there it goes. Okay. All right. Let me get through here. All right, so historical evidence confirms that Jude, brother of James, wrote the letter which bears his name. It's found in the Muratorian Canon, which was written about 170 AD. About 200 Tertullian credited the epistle to Jude, although he wrongly called him an apostle, referred to Jude as an apostle, which he wasn't. About 210, Clement of Alexandria mentions the epistle of Jude. Some have questioned the inspiration of the book of Jude on two grounds, and this is where we're going to spend a little bit of time. And let me explain why before I get into this text, because there's a lot here. The only reason I'm bringing this up is I want to help us to see a way to argue with people, and I don't mean argumentative, argue, the idea of give a defense for, okay? To defend is to look at why some people would say this is not an inspired book, or in this case, there's other books that we're missing. Does anybody know the two books that are supposedly mentioned in Jude that are not inspired books, but they say that Jude quotes from them? The book of Enoch and the Assumption of Moses. Okay. Then what people say is, oh, well, he quoted from this book, so those books must be inspired too. And where are those books? And if we found a copy of that book, then that must be an inspired book because he quoted from it. Okay. So I want to lay out some arguments here for you so you can understand that you can still put trust in the text, even though people are going to use those kind of arguments. And you can defend it, those kind of arguments, by actually going back and taking a little bit of time to listen to what people say and then say, that's actually not what they said. You're saying that's what they said, but that's not what they said. So, and if they did say it, then how do we defend against that? That's why I want to bring this up, because this is a good example of where people are going to say the lost books of the Bible, right? Where are they? All right, so here's the two grounds. They claim Jude quoted from the book of Enoch and the Assumption of Moses, both uninspired works. Verse 9 and verse 14 is where you find those quotes. Paul quoted from heathen poets in Acts 17:28, Titus 1, 12 and 13. This does not mean he endorsed all they said, but only the part quoted. And these were even heathen writings. So he's quoting from them because this is what they believe in. And he says this statement is true, although they may not have understood what they were saying. The fact of what they're saying is correct. And he uses that as an instrument to get them to listen to him. They're like, oh, well, he's talking about somebody we trust. He says, let me talk about this guy that your poets wrote about, and I'll explain to you further who he really is. All right. But it doesn't mean that he's saying that those are inspired writings. The apocryphal book of Enoch was discovered, get this, in 1773 in a copy of the Ethiopian Bible and was first translated into English in 1821. It cannot with certainty be traced back to the 3rd century. So when people are saying that he quoted from the book of Enoch, which would have been prior to the New Testament, that book wasn't even discovered till 1773. We're talking 1,600 years after the 1st century they find this, okay? The book of Enoch could be quoting Jude. I mean, since this comes after Jude, Enoch could have taken from, or whoever wrote that book, could have taken from Jude and then wrote that in there and said, oh, all right. As to the book of Enoch, if quoted by Jude, his quotation of a passage from it gives an inspired sanction only to the truth of that passage. So if in fact, let's say that we only discovered the book in 1773, but it existed prior to that time, because we're going to have one of the church fathers who mentions something about Enoch. So let's say that this actually did exist before then. That still doesn't mean that Jude is giving credibility to the book of Enoch. Only the part in there that was said would have been a true statement, because he's given it by inspiration, unless, of course, he quotes it as a false statement, which he could do that too. He could quote the passage and say he was wrong in this, but he quotes it as if it's a true statement. But in that case, it's only the truth of that passage, and no way to consider the whole book as being a book that is canon. Just as Paul, by inspiration and sanctions particular sentiments of Aratus, Epimenides, and Menander, and their writings. It is taking a good deal for granted when you are told that Jude 14 and 15 quotes the book of Enoch, 1:9. Jude quotes only Enoch, and does not say that he quotes any book or writing. That's also the other thing. People are saying, oh, he quoted the book of Enoch. Well, if you go back and you read Jude, is Jude saying that he's quoting from the book of Enoch? Or is he quoting Enoch? So to say that Enoch even wrote a book is presumptuous, right? He could just by inspiration be quoting something that Enoch actually said, just that quote. So where do you get the idea of a book? 1773, we show up and here's this book in the Ethiopian Bible, and oh, it's the only one that contains it, and now all of a sudden we have this book of Enoch that must have existed prior to the point because of what we read in Jude. So again, it is taken a good deal for granted when we are told that Jude 14 and 15 quotes the book of Enoch 1:9. Jude quotes only Enoch and does not say that he quotes any book or writing. Nor is Jude 9 a quotation from the assumption of Moses, assumption of Moses. When this apocryphal work was written, it is not known. It exists only in fragmentary form in Latin and in a translation from the Greek, which was discovered by Sirani in 1861, which is further translations of it. It had to be edited in order to be intelligible. It seems to be the composition of a patriotic Pharisee. So it's so far removed when people, and this is not saying that they disagree with the inspiration of Jude. What they're saying is Jude is, this other book must be inspired because he's quoting from this other book. So this is the first part of the argument. That just because somebody comes up and they say they have a book that somebody quoted in the Bible, doesn't mean that the book they're quoting from is an inspired work. And in fact, Jude never says that it's an inspired book. He just quotes Enoch as saying this.
Well, same thing like the Quran. It quotes the Old Testament a lot.
Yeah, there's a lot in there. The Book of Mormon has a lot of quotes from the King James Version Bible. Right. But it doesn't mean it's an inspired book. The quotes were inspired in their original writings, right? Or the writer was inspired in the New Testament to write them. These people just copy. It's like if I'm saying everything that I read out of Jude comes from my mouth that's inspired. No, I'm reading an inspired word, but I'm not inspired in reading it.
Just because he quoted somebody doesn't make it untrue. You know,
Right.
you look at that, because the Bible quotes Satan.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's not true.
Yeah, you go back to the Garden of Eden. What he was saying, was that in fact true? What he was telling Adam and Eve in the garden? No, he was actually speaking a lie. So go over here and look in Jude 14. So Jude 14 says, it was also about these men that Enoch in the seventh generation from Adam prophesied, saying, behold, the Lord came with many thousands of his holy ones to execute judgment upon all and to convict all the ungodly of all their ungodly deeds which they have done in an ungodly way, and of all harsh things which ungodly sinners have spoken against him. These are grumblers, finding fault. Okay. In that passage, did Jude say, quoting from the book of Enoch? Did he say he was quoting from the book of Enoch? No, what did he say he was doing?
He was talking about Enoch, who was in the fourth flood.
And he prophesied, right? So by inspiration, he's just quoting what Enoch said. So that doesn't even mean that a book of Enoch existed. And then when you take a look at when you actually find the copy of it, it's in an Ethiopian Bible, and it's, 1,700 years removed from the first century. Maybe somebody was sitting around and said, hey, I think I'll write a book of Enoch. And so they did. And then they said, oh, here you go. And the person being familiar with Jude puts this quote in there because that's the only thing you would have that you could tie to this book to make it seem authentic, right? Grab a quote out of the Bible, put it in this book. It's like, look, Jude was quoting from this book. Well, how did you get from the first century to the 1800s, 1700s, and all of a sudden say, that's the book he quoted from? I don't know how you jump that. Well, this is how you do it. You don't believe in inspiration and you're trying to ruin credibility and inspiration, so you throw this in there. Or you're trying to make this other book seem like it has credibility, so then you say, well, the reason it has credibility is because Jude quoted from it. Well, no, Jude didn't quote from a book. Jude doesn't say he quoted from a book. Jude, by inspiration, is quoting what Enoch, by inspiration, prophesied. That's all he's doing. All right. The critics claim that Jude borrowed from Peter because of great similarity between Jude and 2 Peter. This is one of the arguments against it being inspired, because they're saying basically what he did is he just copied what Peter was saying, or borrowed from it very, very heavily. Where's another argument like that made in the New Testament? The Gospels. Yeah, the Gospels. There are, the synoptics. Because they're so familiar, they had to borrow. Mark must have been written first, and then Matthew borrowed from him, and then Luke. So the Gospels, they just borrowed from one another. Well, by inspiration, they could be quoting things very similar. You could be talking about a similar situation, but to a different audience with a different goal in mind, and still mention similar things. That doesn't mean you're borrowing from their book. All that means is by inspiration, God is having you record these things for a particular reason. And when you go back and look at why Matthew, Mark, and Luke were written and who they were written to, begin to understand the reason why they are similar yet still different.
James and 1 Peter have a lot of similarities.
Yeah.
They associated with one another, and the Holy Spirit wanted to get the message out clearly in ways that we will understand it. So
Yeah.
It doesn't matter that, and if you take a look at Paul's writings, he covers many times the same thing. In the same letter, he'll accentuate
Yeah.
something in the same chapter or something.
Okay. And this is a good point you just made, and we're going to get to that. After something, right? After something. And this is, and I'm not going to go, let me just get to this, because you'll see the point you're making, Ken, is a valid point in arguing why Jude is saying what he's saying, and it's likened to what Peter was saying, okay? So hold off on that. Both were inspired by the same Holy Spirit. If one borrowed from another, he did it by inspiration. If he was, it doesn't make a difference if he actually did that. It's still by inspiration. It doesn't take away the validity of it. The Holy Spirit may have revealed the same message to both writers, for they're both faced with the same situation, right? If you deal with a similar situation, he may be inspiring them in such ways to write a very similar message because of the similar situation. I would say this: it's not a similar situation. It is the exact situation. And I'll show you why I believe that to be true. Linsky does an excellent job in breaking this down, and this is where you get into the meat of this, where you can look at it and you can see what Peter is saying and what Jude is saying, and in all likelihood, they're writing to the same group of people, right? But there's a difference in when they're writing what they're writing. Let me not give too much away here. All right, so this is Linsky's argument. It's a great argument. Peter prophesies, also among you there shall be, and again I'm quoting from, this is probably a King James translation because I just took Linsky's quote, okay? Also among you there will also be pseudo-teachers, New American Standard says false teachers, such as, etc. 2 Peter 2:1. They shall be mockers, 2 Peter 3:3. Jude 4 records the fulfillment of this prophecy. They did creep in covertly, some men, those who long ago have been written down in advance from this for this sentence. The kind of men who, according to Peter, shall come, who, according to Jude, did actually come. Jude describes in terms that are taken from Peter, to which he adds expressions of his own. So Jude also repeats some of the divine judgments on the ungodly that were referred to by Peter, and adds still others of the same kind. Jude rests on 2 Peter. It does. Because they are to the same audience for the same reason, except for one difference. And I've already read in there. What's the one difference? Time. Okay? Mayer answers this view and proves the opposite by just one sentence. Namely, that in his description, Peter uses 4 present tenses. 4 present tense. So present tense verb. Does this cancel the 3 future tenses? There shall be pseudo-teachers. They shall bring in covertly. They shall come mockers. Are these not prophecy? Peter has employed these future tenses in decisive places. The first and the second at the beginning of chapter 2. The third at the beginning of chapter 3. The first 2 prophetic futures begin the chapter in which the libertinism of these coming pseudo-teachers is set forth at length. The third prophetic future begins the chapter in which these mockers in mockery scoff at the parousia of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, that coming of his, second coming, the parousia. After Peter has thus said that such men shall be and shall come among his readers, he describes them fully and thus in a perfectly natural way says, they do not tremble. They are not waterless springs. They entice. It escapes them. Those are all present tense, right? Where the others were all future tense. They're going to come. So the confusion is, why is Peter talking about a future tense event, but now he's talking about these people in a present tense? Well, it's natural. Because what he's doing is he's saying they're going to come and this is what they are like. They're not going to be like this in the future. They are presently already like this. Sonny.
This can kind of be compared to what, when Paul wrote to the church of Corinth, and he quoted exactly what was said
Right.
at the Lord's Supper.
Yeah.
And the reason was is those people were doing it wrong, and this is just that all over again, only about something else.
But here's a good point to that argument, Sonny. What was the one thing that Paul changed in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 about the Lord's Supper? Jesus said what? Do this. Paul added something to it. What did he say? For as often as you proclaim his death. Jesus didn't say that at the Lord's Supper. Jesus didn't say you proclaim his death. Why didn't he say it? You said that last week, Rick. Why didn't he say it? He hadn't died yet. So Paul adds it. Why? Because he's adding to the situation. This is what Jesus said. This is why Jesus said to do it. Now Paul's going to add this other part because this is now the fulfillment. You are now proclaiming his death. What he said was going to happen has happened. So in a similar way, we're seeing that with this argument. So when he is painting their picture, these tenses are the proper ones. Pseudo-teachers, mockers, shall be, shall come, and then are this and that, do this and that, right? So they're going to come, and this is what they're going to do. So there's not a problem with going from a future tense and then describing them in a present tense in their action. These subsequent descriptions do not cancel and annul Peter's three decisive future tenses and the prophecy which Peter utters. Now look at Jude's aorist, verse 4. They did creep in covertly, some men. So he's using the aorist present tense. They did creep in covertly, etc. The very ones with reference to whom Peter uses future tense, such as shall bring in covertly heresies of perdition, etc. He uses a compound with para on the side covertly and ice exactly as Jude does. Peter, and this is the point, Peter has the prophetic future. Jude has the aorist fulfillment, right? Peter does not once use such an aorist with reference to these false teachers and mockers. They were yet to come. When Jude wrote, they had come, had stolen in. Peter said, they shall steal in these heresies. So if you're arguing that Jude is not inspired because he borrowed from Peter, this argument wipes that out because the way they argue is different. They may be saying the same thing or very similar, but one is arguing Peter future tense. Jude is arguing present tense. So this is what happened. Peter, by inspiration, wrote an epistle telling them what? What would happen? False teachers are going to come. When you look at the purpose of Jude, and we'll get to that in a second, but I want you to go here and take a look at this first part. Look in verse 3. Jude wanted to write about something else. What do you want to write about, Ken? Their common faith, the common salvation, right? Beloved, while I was making every effort to write to you about our common salvation, I felt the necessity to write. That's the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. He was going to write about their common salvation. But by inspiration, he was moved to write about what? The fulfillment of what Peter had been talking about. So Peter is talking about what's going to come. Jude then is writing about they've showed up. This is them. And he's going to use similar descriptions, if not identical in some places, as to what Peter had said. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And that does in no way takes away from the inspiration of the text. When some commentators consider the present tense used by Peter, they sometimes think that Peter means that the false teachers were already present. like they were already in the church causing these problems. But this is evidently a misunderstanding. When they shall arrive, Peter says that his readers shall then find what these men are to do. And so that's why he does future tense and then present tense action. When you get to Jude, Jude says, Eris, this is what's going on right now. Thus, the audience then could be seen as the exact same audience, right? That who Peter wrote to, Jude, in all likelihood, was writing to them to make them aware of this.
Also, the dating on this, I know that most people say that Revelation is the last book. I've thought that Jude was the last book because it says, approaching you, contend earnestly for the faith which once for all was delivered to the saints. Also in 5 it says that you know all things once for all. So
Right.
to me, that would indicate it was probably the last book written.
Because you're saying since Revelation would have had to been written by that point in time.
Because that was not all the faith revealed. If you take Revelation out, if that's the case, I mean, it makes a really good case for the fact that Jude, being the last one written, didn't really borrow from anybody.
Well, yeah.
It was the culmination.
Of what it, well, and we'll take a look at the date here because the date is arbitrary on this. We don't know. That's the thing about Jude. There's only things that you can speculate as far as figuring out the date here, right? So written prior to the destruction of Jerusalem, approximately. So this is the most common theory, that probably before the destruction of Jerusalem, and it's not a hard and fast rule, but what would be the reason and the typical argument of why you would say Jude was written before the destruction of Jerusalem? Because it doesn't mention it, right? And I've argued, okay, I can accept that, but I also need to understand that the writer doesn't always have to mention some event for it to have been written, right? It doesn't have to. But in lieu of trying to have an exact date for you, it's like, where could we pinpoint this? Going back to Peter's writings and saying, okay, well, we know when Peter was here, we know when he was here, we know in all likelihood when this was written, 2 Peter, so where would you put this one in that chain? And so the general consensus, again, it's not hard and fast, is 64 to 68 AD, primarily based on the fact that the destruction of Jerusalem hadn't yet happened, or at least it wasn't recorded that it happened. Yeah.
It could, I mean, destruction of Jerusalem, if it was written after Revelation, after 95 AD or whatever you want to put it, why would you mention it?
Yeah.
I mean, it was.
If you're that far removed from it, is what you're saying, which is, you know, that could be true. All right, so this is what Guy and Wood says. He says, concerning the date, all of which we may be sure is that it was written during the latter half of the 1st century of the Christian era, and that has been preserved for us as a product of inspiration. So, using Ken's argument that because he says to contend earnestly for the faith once for all delivered, or for all time delivered, literally, then the Revelation would be the final New Testament document, right? If most people put that there, they say Revelation is. But if the faith has been delivered once for all, and that means, which it does, the faith means the system of justification, the whole realm of the gospel, what it means to be a Christian, how to live as a Christian, what the epistles write about, all of that, not just the gospel, but all of it, then Revelation could be held to fall into that category, which then could push Jude beyond the date of Revelation. But we don't have any way to pinpoint it, just arguments based upon lack of evidence, lack of mention or something, the possibility that the faith once for all delivered would include the Revelation, which I could understand that as a good argument.
So Revelation was written as a future.
We'll say, okay, now this, and then let's not get, because we're going to do Revelation here coming up. But the thing with Revelation is you've got, are we dealing with a all future event? Are we dealing with current event and some future event? It depends on who you're reading when you.
It's like 3 different translations within Revelations, but it was written for the people who were being tormented and executed and whatnot, and it gives them a reason to live. So then that puts it kind of before Jude also.
It could, and how we date the Revelation is one by John, right? He's the writer of it.
Right.
looking at when he was writing, what he was writing, where he was when he was writing, but also how, where the church is at that point in time. You can also argue that because the church has gone off into such apostasy at that point in time, or headed that direction, when you begin to read about the 7 churches, right, beginning in Revelation 4, you're seeing the church is moving away from the truth. Well, that could be at the tail end of what Jude is writing, right? You could argue that. Well, see, what happened was they wrote these things, and all of a sudden we're moving into that. And now the struggles that they're facing in the Revelation, the type of persecution they're facing, could be that Domitian rather than, certainly not Nero's, but more that 90 AD time period. So I think the point is not losing sight of what the epistles are writing about and not get hung up on exactly when they were written. Because whether or not I figure out when Revelation was written or when Jude was written, the story stays true. The purpose, what is there still is applicable to me.
When you've got questions like that, you need to ask yourself, do I have a need to know?
Yeah, what is and in some cases, when you're doing scholarly, talking with, people who are questioning, yeah, but for your own faith, it's good information to have so you can try to get your mind around some things. Dates are good because you can go back historically and see what was going on and what they were facing when that was happening. But yeah, you're right, as far as my salvation is concerned. We already know who the New Testament rulers are. The audience, Jude identifies the recipients of his letter as them that are sanctified by God the Father and preserved in Jesus Christ and called in verse 1. So there's nothing in the book that indicates it's either Jewish or Gentile Christians. He doesn't do that. And we've seen where epistles certainly would address them as a Jewish, Gentile, either way or both, right? But not in this one. There's no geographical location mentioned. We go back, we see where some of the epistles are introduced to regions, right? We don't have that in here, or certain cities. We don't have that either. It addresses a problem common throughout the church in the first century and the church today, the danger of false teachers. So that wasn't just a local, that was going to be in the church wherever you were. And it's not just applicable to their point in time. That exists today. We can say that the book is for all Christians in all ages. Now, if you want to pinpoint it to a specific group of people, right, this is what Haley says. The similarity of the situation in Jude and that mentioned in 2 Peter suggests a possibility that this letter may have been addressed to the same churches as to those Peter addressed in the first and second letters in churches, that is Asia Minor. So if it is the same, which I wouldn't have a problem arguing that Jude is writing to these same congregations, but the broader audience is everybody, wherever you are, realize this is what false teachers are about. And when you understand how he describes false teachers in here, this is not something to take lightly. I think too many people look at churches out there today and they don't recognize the harm that they're causing. And I want to share that with you in here when he talks about the purpose. Jude had intended to write a treatise on the common salvation. We saw that verse 3. But a crisis arose in the church which caused him to change his plans. He wrote instead to urge Christians to earnestly contend for the faith once delivered to the saints. To contend means to engage in strife as a combat. It comes from the Greek word from which we get agonize. So this is serious, right? He's saying you need to agonize. You need to fight against these people in an agonizing way. Not in, oh, we're just all trying to get to heaven together. And I know you're teaching something different, but we all just love Jesus. That's just agreement, right? We just agree to disagree, that kind of argument. He says you need to contend as in a strife, a combatant. You need to fight these people. I don't mean physically, but you need to fight them with the truth and stand up against them in an agonizing way. The faith means the gospel and the body of revealed doctrine to believed and obeyed. So it's the whole system of justification, right? And this is where Ken bases his argument, which is a valid argument. The idea that, well, if it's that body, revelation would be found in that argument. It would have to be. So you could look at that as well. Once is the idea of finality. Contend for the faith once for all. The idea of finality, once for all time. God's word has been revealed, confirmed, and written. So you have the truth. Whatever someone's bringing to you, whatever lost books that they've discovered out there, that, the book of Enoch, the Assumption of Moses, and, all these other books, these were not accepted texts of the time. And so for somebody talking about lost books of the Bible, the Book of Mormon, another revelation of Jesus Christ, no. Contend earnestly for the faith once for all delivered, once for all time. There is no other time when it would be delivered. It had been delivered. Guy Woods wrote that the Epistle of Jude, now this is important. Listen how he says this. Denunciatory in nature, severe in tone, and full of warning against those whose evil and ungodly activity was threatening the peace and the security of the church. These false teachers were not simply just mistaken and we're just, trying to get to heaven the same way. We all love Jesus. If that's the case, why did Peter say that they secretly introduced, what kind of heresies did Peter call them? Destructive heresies. What are they going to destroy, Chad? They're going to destroy your faith. They're going to destroy your soul. They're going to attempt to destroy the church. So these are destructive heresies. They're things that sound like they can get you into heaven, but in fact, get you to hell.
So this goes on daily around here too with all these little churches and the names.
Right, exactly. That's why when you look out there, it's like, okay, just keep this in mind. Now, this is from, I think this comes from World Video Bible. This writer took and he just listed the characteristics of these false teachers from verse 4 to 19 of this book. Listen. They're godless men. They change the grace of our God into a license for immorality. They deny Jesus Christ. Like Sodom, they are given to sexual immorality. They are dreamers who pollute their own bodies. Like unreasonable animals, they destroy themselves. Blemishes at your love feast. Shepherds who feed only themselves. Clouds without rain. Trees without fruit. Wild waves of the sea foaming up their shame. Wandering stars from whom the blackness of darkness has been reserved. They are grumblers, fault finders, boasting about themselves. Scoffers who follow their own godly desires. They do not have the Spirit. They flatter others for their own advantage. They are people who divide you. Oh, that's Haley's. They are people who divide you. He says that from verse 4 to what, 19? That's a lot to say. That's why when Brother Woods said, it's the way he writes this is very pointed. He's going at them hard. He's not being, these are just errant brethren who got some mistake. No, he's letting it be known that these false teachers are there to destroy.
And most of the time when they come in, they're trying to change what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
What you're doing, I would like to attend here. However, you guys don't have a piano, and
Yeah.
I like a piano.
Yeah.
So we're not here for you and your likes.
We're here to serve God.
Problem with that.
Yeah.
And usually when they're trying to change it because it's what they like.
Well, and what happens in it, then you begin to become not what the Lord wants. And they will use these type of hot button issues, gotcha questions. Oh, so are you telling me that if I use the instrument, I'm going to go to hell? Okay, so that's one of those loaded questions. And what I always say is,
Worship's in vain.
well, I always believe, yes, I always believe that any rebellion against God will condemn you. So if you're rebelling against God, if that's a rebellion against God, do you suppose you would be saved if you willfully continue to rebel against him? Why would you think that you would be saved if you willfully rebel against him?
The big one is baptism required. Well, I don't like that.
Hey, I read an article today. That stated that there is a congregation out there. Now, I don't want to, I'm not going to give you the name of the congregation because I can't make the exact correlation or if they agree with it. But there's a lady who started some kind of ministry, and this congregation is listed as a primary supporter of this lady, Church of Christ. She just married a woman. And so this article was put out, and they're saying it's coming to the church's door. Now, what I would want to, that's why I'm not going to tell you the name of the congregation, because I would like to say this could be as big a surprise to them as anybody else. They're going to be like, well, before this happened, we didn't know any of this stuff. Now, okay, we're going to disassociate ourselves with her. But this is people in the church who are now, and she wrote a book on it, arguing why God blesses homosexuality and marriages. All right. This is an interesting thing, too. Thank you. I don't know. I had a speech impediment when I was growing up as a kid, and some things just never go away. So, peculiarity. How do you say it, Chad? Peculiarity. What are you laughing at, Janelle? I see that laughing at me. Of the epistle of Jude. I can say Jude. It's only 3. Is that everything is said in groups of 3. Look at this. He describes his readers as sanctified, preserved, and called. He wished for them mercy, peace, and love. He reminded them of 3 instances of God's judgment: the Israelites in the wilderness, the angels who fell, Sodom and Gomorrah. He said of the false teachers that they defile the flesh, despise dominion, and speak evil of dignities. He said that the false teachers have followed the examples of Cain, Balaam, and Korah. He called them murmurers, complainers, and walkers after their own lust. He further said of the false teachers that they separate themselves, are sensual, and do not have the Spirit. So he puts these in groups of 3, which is just an interesting way to do it, because it really adds emphasis to it. You're adding emphasis to what you're saying. All right. Here's the outline. Very simple. Greeting and occasion of the writing. Biblical examples of false teachers and evil men. A description of the wickedness of the false teachers. The apostles' prediction of these false teachers. The way to deal with those who have been led astray by these false teachers. And then the benediction. So, pretty simple to outline this book. And then here's some lessons. There's 5 or 6 of them here, 5. There are not many faiths, but only one. That's a lesson you take from this. Because he said, do what? Contend earnestly for the what? The faith. It's not enough to be religious, but one must be right religiously in order to go to heaven. So it's not enough to say that you're a religious person. What you believe in needs to be true as well. You need to believe in Christ as the Son of God, right? You need to believe that you can't live in sin, so forth. There is an objective, absolute body of truth called the faith or the gospel, which can be used to test religious beliefs, opinion, and practices. Notice, Jude doesn't go into the doctrines, right? But he's telling you that there is a faith that you can use to hold up against them to see as a light whether they are of the faith or not. So there is a way, and today in our religious world, that doesn't exist. Because there's no particular faith. There are faiths with an S on the end of it. Multiple faiths that are out there. So you really can't tell. Because I can go to one person and hold this faith light up and they go, oh yeah, you fit perfectly. But hold to this person and say, oh, you would be better at that church. And then take theirs up and hold it over here and go, oh, you would fit good with us. And somebody else would go, no, you'd be better over there. Well, so there's not one standard.
Church of your choice.
Church of your choice. But if there is the faith, you can hold that one doctrine up and you can know whether you're part of it and help others to become part of it. There is an ever-present danger of false teachers leading astray the faithful. It's not something that was just part of the first century. It applies to us today. False teachers will appear to be humble, pious, sincere, meek, loving, gentle, and kind in order to more easily deceive the gullible. As I always say, Satan's not going to put a sign up on the building, the Church of Christ, Satan worships here, come on in. Okay? He's not going to just expose himself the false teachers don't just come in and just expose themselves as false teachers. Peter said they secretly introduce, right? They have a way of convincing people that what they're saying is true, and then the people end up accepting it. And before you know it, they've fallen away from the faith. And what's amazing about these people, if you go back and read 2 Peter as well, is that often what they appeal to get people to follow them is the flesh. Both Peter and Jude talk about their sensuality. He talks about these false teachers appealing to the weakness of people already, right? That they're going to appeal to them in such a way as they go, well, you know, I've always thought that was okay to do that. I didn't see any reason why I couldn't have 5 wives. You know, and they're telling me that it's a perfectly good thing to have 5 wives. What about your wife having 5 husbands? I don't think that's right, but I think I can have 5 wives. Okay, so they appeal to that, you know, greed, lust, and I saw a story years ago where a man was using the Bible to convince his wife that polygamy was okay. Right there, see, honey? Well, I say a man, I mean, what church was that? What was his name? Joseph something? Oh, Smith. Joseph Smith. Yeah, he was using that to convince everybody that. And you know, you had a lot of men joining that church. Typically, you find more women joining the church than you do men. But when you start telling the men that, by the way, you can have a bunch of wives, they're like, oh, what do I sign up? Do you want to know if that's true or not? I know it's true because you said it. And I want that. Okay. So they're out there, and we need to not take this lightly. Jude, if this is what they were dealing with in the first century, look what happened to the church. Look how quickly the apostasy comes. When all of a sudden you have the church shrinks, it stays there, it never goes away. In Daniel chapter 2, the kingdom's never going to be left to another, so it's always there. But you see this huge apostasy taking place. Even Paul talked about that in 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, that this apostasy was going to happen first. And then we see these religions that become rooted in fleshly things, sensual things. And people like that because they can be religious and they can give over to their flesh as well. And you know what's interesting about that? Even the Jews argued for that. If you go back to Romans in chapter 5, remember when Paul was talking, before he brings it, chapter 6, when he brings in the idea of a baptism? They asked the question, because he talks about through Adam came sin, through sin comes death, right? Through one man comes death, but through one man comes life, chapter 5 of Romans. And he says that grace abounded through that sin. And what was the question they asked? Or that he answers with that, because he knows what they're thinking. Shall we sin? Rick. That grace may abound. So their idea was, can't we give into sensual things so more grace will come? And if you were to say, sure, then you're like, sign me up. If I can just live in sin and God's grace will abound to me, sign me up. Well, that's what these people were doing. And I think we see a lot of that out there today, where so much is being taught under the name of Christianity, and it's just dealing with sensuality, dealing with people's fleshly desires. And hey, you know, if I can be religious and still live a sinful life, sign me up for that one. All right.
Paul said, may it never be.
May it never be? Yeah, how should you who... Well, here's the deal. How shall you who have died to Christ, right, still live it? We see that's the thing. They haven't died to Christ, have they? See, he's telling the people who've been baptized, you've died to Christ in baptism. That's why all these other religions out there, they haven't done that. That's why it's easy for them to accept giving themselves over to sensuality, because they've never died to Christ in baptism. They're still living in their sin. So they say, haven't you been baptized into Christ? No, I don't need to be. His grace covers me while I sin. So, all right, good for you.